Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Call of Duty Black Ops 7 using the RTX 5070 Ti. We're using the ASUS TUF Gaming OC version of the card that has 16 gigabytes of GDDR7. We're playing on the latest NVIDIA drivers, pairing with a 9800X 3D as well as 64 gigabytes of DDR5. Let's hop in. Alright, starting off here at 1080p while our shaders load in here, and I will mention up front, I always forget to mention this, but there's timestamps for all settings and resolutions tested if you want to jump around. Starting off here at 1080p, 5070 Ti is an incredibly powerful GPU, so I do just want to go straight off the bat to max settings. We're not going to use any upscaling or sharpening. We do have DLAA as well as DLSS. However, the default TAA option, for my experience, even at 1080p, TAA is probably good enough. We could go for DLAA and get maybe a little bit cleaner of an image, but let's just see what we can get here at max 1080p. Alright, so loading in here at max 1080p settings. Strangely enough, our CPU utilization is very high. That may be due to the fact that maybe it's still loading in some shaders, even though it claimed to be done. Game looks great here, of course. At extreme, we are getting very, very competitive settings. So, we are getting on average here, well above that 120 FPS kind of loose target that I like to kind of try to focus on. And actually well beyond close to 200 FPS on our average, or actually now exceeding 200 FPS. So yeah, 1080p is really not going to be an issue for you really whatsoever. You can, obviously this is max settings too, so we can and we will test some of the lower settings, though, when you are kind of seeing this type of performance, this is certainly where you will definitely see a bit of a CPU bottleneck. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to really utilize our GPU a ton more than we are right now. See, we're using just about 12 gigabytes of video memory, only pulling 170 watts. So very efficient, very well optimized game here in Call of Duty. And as I run around the entire map, don't see anyone, but the game runs well, looks good. Now we can make it look a little bit better, so around 200 FPS on our average here. And our next option here is to go for a more advanced anti-aliasing. So we don't have here any options as far as seeing what kind of anti-aliasing is applied. I think it is a TAA. Here we can go ahead and just apply DLAA, which uses that DLSS model, which I believe it uses F for the DLAA. And here we can, this is not using any sort of upscaling when it comes to the DLSS model, rather just using the actual technology itself to kind of redraw the pixels and just act as an anti-aliasing method. So it does look very sharp, and we are seeing a pretty significant performance dip here, about 50 FPS being taken off of our average here. But it doesn't look like a sharper image for sure, especially when you're stationary like this. Everything looks really crystal clear and sharp. Now, much more likely what you'd probably do rather than using DLAA in that instance is just go for DLSS and say, if, we're not really looking to get a major improvement as far as our upscaling, but you can kind of just come in here and use the quality preset. The quality preset does now use that transformer model, so there is something to be said for using a more advanced model as opposed to the CNN model that's applied to the DLAA. And we'll see if this actually even gives us a noticeable improvement to our FPS. So honestly, here at DLSS quality using the transform model, strangely enough, it's actually getting, looks to be slightly worse performance when compared to just completely native. Bit strange, considering the fact that we are actually no longer playing at our native 1440p resolution, but I guess, now we are using that transform model, those tensor cores, to kind of implement that DLSS. Does look actually pretty good, though, in my opinion. It actually probably looks maybe even a little bit stronger than just playing at native. So these are really probably the settings I would stick with as far as going for the extreme preset, but I do just want to test out, see if we can get maybe a even more competitive experience if we were just kind of crank our, well, maybe not crank, but just use a bit more aggressive. So rather than going for quality, if we just go down to balanced, this should also, still use that transform model. See if this gives us any sort of improvement to our FPS average. And honestly, it's not really looking super significant for our FPS. Really seems pretty similar across the board between quality, our native option when we're talking about just using the default TAA, and then coming down to balanced here. So I'd probably personally just go for the quality option here if you're going to be playing at max 1080p settings, and if you wanted, you know, to use a little bit more aggressive, or if you want to play at, you know, native resolution, I'd probably opt for just going for the default native as opposed to implementing DLAA. If you were looking to get a more competitive setting, this is where at 1080p you'd want to come down to minimum. Now, the reason I'm going straight to minimum, because I've tested some of these other settings, and honestly, they all look pretty similar to minimum once you come off of extreme or ultra. So, my opinion, if you're kind of looking to just get, you know, a very high FPS, just go straight over for minimum. And there are a few issues with minimum that I'll show and talk about in a moment here. But this is just minimum native 1080p. Let's just make sure we are actually playing it native. Bump that up to 100. I hate when these graphic settings change our render resolution. All right, so playing here at minimum, and this is native resolution. Let me just, I'm all paranoid. Let me just double check we are in fact at native. Okay, yes, 100% resolution scale. So this is another way to kind of come in and achieve a very, very high FPS. So, you know, when you start going down to minimum, the game, it's a competitive setting, so you can see obviously our performance is incredible. You know, 300 FPS average, 200 FPS 1% lows, but you are, you know, sacrificing quite a bit to kind of achieve this level of performance. So the main things that I notice are the shadow quality. You can see like our character shadow, super blocky, pixelated, and textures. So you can see when we go ADS, now looking at our gun, doesn't look super great. But, you know, if you're playing on the minimum preset here, you're kind of just looking for a more competitive setting. You probably don't care all that much about, oh, am I getting good looking visuals? You're willing to kind of at this point just sacrifice the visuals for, you know, higher FPS. So that's certainly what we're seeing here, getting right around 300 FPS on our average, 200 FPS 1% low, silky smooth performance here. Definitely a really strong case to be made for, you know, this is a really solid place to play at if you're just at 1080p, have a 5070 Ti, want a high competitive FPS. Now let's see if we can get even higher. So going for that DLSS, we are going to stick with transformer. Just keep in mind, if you did go for the CNN model here, you would get slightly better performance at the cost of some pretty, you know, noticeably worse visuals. So we'll see if dumping down to, you know, some upscaling even really helps us all that much. At 1080p here, it seems to maybe be a more CPU bound scenario where I'm not actually seeing super significant improvements when it actually comes to our FPS as a result of the upscaling. So while we're not getting like a major improvement to our actual performance, I will say just applying this DLSS model just adds this like kind of sharpening effect that kind of does make the game just look a little bit better in general. So even though we're not really being rewarded like we typically are at, you know, some different resolutions with higher performance, the visuals and the sharpness and the clarity of the image, in my opinion, is actually an improvement, even though that is kind of counterintuitive because you're going from playing at native resolution to not playing at native resolution. The transformer model, when compared to, you know, something like just TAA, is actually pretty noticeable as far as just the improvement. So I do think even if you you know, don't necessarily need or are not necessarily seeing the improvement to your actual performance or your FPS, I do think implementing the transform model is probably what I would personally opt for because it is giving you a pretty significant improvement to your overall picture quality. Now moving up to 1440p at extreme settings. So native resolution, extreme, max settings at 1440p now. All right, so here at 1440p max settings, this, you know, 5070 Ti is really a 1440p card. You know, it's certainly overkill for 1080p. So as we go into 1440p, I'm going to spend a little bit more time testing a little more presets here. Decent max settings here. Obviously, we're able to get, you know, competitive FPS, as we can see, saying right around 130 on our average, 1% low down at 90. And the image does look really, really solid here, I will say. Even though we're just using, you know, the default anti-aliasing, which I believe again is TAA, just, you know, kind of comes stock built in when you don't have any sort of upscaling options applied, does still look really, really solid and is obviously giving us really great performance as well. So honestly, if I was playing at 1440p and I just kind of wanted good looking visuals, solid FPS, this is probably where I'd play at. I mean, it's not like ultra high FPS, 200 300 like we were seeing at 1080p, but it's certainly high enough for, you know, someone like me who just, you know, I'm not that I'm playing competitively or anything like that. but it's certainly high enough FPS that I don't feel like I'm at a competitive disadvantage. So around 130 FPS or so at just, native here. So let's go ahead and let's just throw on a little bit of that DLSS. Now that we are at 1440p, we can certainly go even lower than balanced. Let's start off at balanced here and just see where that kind of brings us up to, where we were around 130 on our average after a little bit of gameplay. See if it does go much higher. We're already seeing a slight improvement, not super significant. Sitting kind of closer, I guess, to like 140, 150 territory most of the time. And we are also getting, of course, that advantage of just kind of using that transform model. So there is just a little bit more like sharper of an image when compared even to native, which I know that sounds weird saying that the balanced preset at, DLSS looks sharper than native, but it's the transform model and, also has that kind of independent sharpening control. So you could also just make the image sharper on its own if that helps, but even just at like the half measure sharpness, the slider halfway, does result in a really solid looking picture and about a 15 FPS improvement here. Now, just to see out of curiosity, if we were to just come in here and say, okay, I want to play at max settings, 1440p, ultra performance DLSS, which is not something I would typically go for at 1080p, but now that we are at 1440p, it does become a little bit more reasonable. It doesn't look quite as bad. Now, there is definitely, some weirdness when it comes to like a little bit more grainy of an effect that we are kind of seeing here that doesn't look super great. But honestly, if you're just kind of running around, I could definitely see someone saying, now we're getting an extra like 80 FPS just about, as opposed to just playing it native. I could see definitely someone making the case for saying, okay, I want to play and I like the look of the graphics preset, but I want a bit higher FPS. I will say that this is a pretty solid option at this point. So let's just actually come off one of our extreme setting, just go down to ultra here at native resolution. So bumping down from extreme to ultra is another way to kind of reclaim a bit of FPS while not actually, meaningfully impacting any of your graphics. So, even though we are getting slightly higher FPS, we're seeing, remember, around 130 or so at this particular option at native resolution. Now we're seeing obviously an improvement up to 160 now coming to ultra, and everything still looks pretty solid. So maybe going for that extreme option isn't always going to be worth it. There is a bit of FPS, and actually a pretty substantial amount of FPS at this point to be, gained from just bumping down from extreme to ultra, and doesn't honestly look all that different in my opinion. 1% lows are great, sitting right around 120, average at 160. Shadows look good, textures look good, game looks really crystal clear and sharp. And we can make it even look a little bit better in my opinion by just throwing on DLSS and say, we still want good looking quality visuals, just go for DLSS at quality. See if this actually gives us any sort of meaningful performance increase. I'm not 100% sure it will, coming from just, native, now that we are using that transform model, which sometimes, if your resolution is kind of what's causing the card or the FPS to kind of struggle, you may see, some improvement. But if it's more the graphics preset, textures, shadows, things like that, that's actually causing the dip in your performance, it's not necessarily going to always increase your FPS using upscaling, which may sound kind of backwards, but while it's not necessarily giving us an improvement to our FPS here, in fact it's giving us slightly worse FPS, I will say that actual visuals do look considerably better, a little bit sharper, just the way it's rendering the image, the anti-aliasing, just a little bit sharper than just having it off completely, due to the fact that when we're just having it off, uses TAA, which is a bit of a softer anti-aliasing solution. It does kind of resolve all those rough edges. There's no major issues with rough edges being apparent, but it does kind of resolve them by just kind of blurring them, as opposed to, using transformer. Resolves them by kind of just sharpening them out. So this is definitely a compelling way to play at these particular settings. And if we did just want, a more competitive experience, going for the minimum option here, go ahead and turn off our anti-aliasing. So this is just minimum at native 1440p resolution. So certainly going for the minimum preset here is another way to play it native 1440p and get a very, very competitive FPS, saying right around 230 to 240 FPS on our average here. Now at TAA, the image does of course look just a little bit soft as we've seen on the rest of our tests here, so definitely once we go in and throw on a bit of DLSS, while it may not actually, meaningfully improve our FPS, it will make the image look considerably sharper, so do have that option as well. But it is definitely nice to see that 1440p, you can get a native, very, very high refresh rate, competitive type setting. Alright, so here at the minimum preset down here, we're still here, so let's see if just throwing on DLSS at balance here, if this gives us any sort of meaningful performance increase. And honestly, as you can see, even going for, a more modest upscaling option here doesn't really super meaningfully improve our FPS, though it does actually result in a much, much sharper image in my opinion. I mean, maybe it's just the sharpening slider and that's as simple as it is, but I do really prefer how DLSS at Transformer resolves kind of the anti-aliasing as opposed to just having it off on TAA. So I would recommend, if you have the card, just throwing on Transformer. Mentioned that when I was testing the 5070, I do think the Transformer model does look really, really strong in this game and certainly is a more, compelling option in my opinion than just going for just the stock default with no upscaling applied. Alright, and finally now moving up to 4K, starting off here at Extreme and just going for Extreme native resolution, so no upscaling or anything like that, playing at 100% resolution scale. Alright, so moving up now to 4K at max settings native resolution, where the TAA does look completely fine at 4K. This is certainly where the TAA really shines. There's not really a great reason not to just go for TAA. Now, if you were playing at native resolution, that is, if you, had any inclination to do any sort of upscaling, the Transform model is going to be a huge thing for us here. But even at native 4K resolution, this game kind of has this weird thing where it seems to really use the same amount of video memory regardless of really the resolution that we're testing at. Notice that across all of my tests, and I think this is like the 6th GPU that I've tested, all of them seem to kind of show the same GPU or the RAM, what am I trying to say here? The video memory VRAM utilization seem to show the same usage starting from 1080p all the way to 4K, kind of hover right around the same spot with very, very little difference. But as you can see here, native 4K getting 92 on our average, 1% lows are above 60 to 64. They're playable settings, not necessarily what I'd consider to be very competitive settings, but definitely really solid playable settings here, and really all we have to go is up from here. So 4K should be a really decent time here. So if we do just come in and say we don't want to change too much, we want to still play at these max settings, let's just throw on our DLSS. And now that we are at 4K, we can certainly just go straight down to balance, which actually I imagine will look even a little bit better than native now that we are using that kind of sharp, good-looking transform model. So now we are getting a slight FPS improvement, not a major one, but coming up to 111 or so, and the image does look considerably sharper, so we are seeing definitely an improvement as far as that goes as well. Consistent 1% low, sitting right around 80 FPS. Really, really solid performance here. Definitely a very, very nice place to play at. And lastly here, if you just want to play at 4K, say maybe you have a 4K monitor, you don't really care about so much about good looking visuals, just going for the minimum preset here is our last one that we'll test. Go ahead and just play at native 4K minimum settings. Alright, so here at minimum settings, it is nice to see that, at 4K native resolution minimum settings, you are able to, holy shit, okay, you are able to natively get a very high FPS. So natively here on a 5070 Ti, a card that, I don't know if I'd consider it to be necessarily a 4K card. I definitely think it's a card that can play 4K and can play it comfortably in a lot of instances, but not necessarily one that I would say oh, I'm playing at 4K, this might, this is my suggestion, get a 5070 Ti, though it can be, serviceable at 4K. But it is nice to see that at 4K minimum settings here, which are competitive settings, I know these are definitely the settings that a lot of people choose to play on regardless of if they can get, similar performance at higher settings, just due to the fact that it kind of has this simplistic kind of style where, things look very dull and drab so that, enemies are more noticeable. So I certainly understand that, the competitive nature of settings like this is more than just the FPS. There's also the appeal of just kind of more simple dumbed down settings being a bit appealing and maybe actually resulting in someone performing better. So I certainly can understand that. And this is definitely giving you very, very competitive settings here when using this minimum preset. Really not a super huge need for any sort of upscaling, though I will check it out. But it is nice to see, even without any upscaling, anything like that, getting 147 FPS average, 98 FPS for our 1% low, incredibly solid. Now it does look kind of crappy, I will say. Like shadows, you can see look terrible. If we look closely, our gun, things like that, ADS, we get up close to textures, they look pretty terrible. And when you're playing at 4K, those sort of like, you know, not so great looking visuals do become more apparent due to the fact that, you know, 4K is typically on a larger monitor, or, you know, just you're typically able to see 4K images a little bit clearer. So some of those not so great looking textures that maybe at, you know, something like 1080p may have been able to, you can kind of hide them. Now that we're on 4K, they may be a little bit more noticeable. So I think choosing the minimum preset at 4K is definitely more of a choice. It is something that you are definitely, you know, if you're doing it, something that you're intentionally doing and okay with kind of this drop in visual quality, you know, to get the FPS that you want. So last thing to do here, you know, we already saw we were getting high FPS at native with the minimum preset. Now, what if we were to say, okay, well, we want the most FPS possible. So we're not happy, you know, with just the 140 FPS. We want as much as possible. So if we did go ultra performance here, now we do start to see very, very solid FPS here, a very competitive FPS. And honestly, the transform model of our DLSS does look really great. So it doesn't look all that much different than playing, you know, without any sort of DLSS on. In my opinion, this is certainly a really, really strong contender for, you know, if you're at 4K, you want to play in a particular place, maybe you have a 4K monitor, you don't really care about the visuals, you just want to get the most FPS possible. Coming in here, 231 FPS average, 173 for 1% lows. Absolutely phenomenal performance here. And really, you know, we can slow down, get close to objects, look at shadows, things like that. But really, when you're just kind of running around and just playing the game, those sort of things, you know, they're not really going to be super significant. So, you know, when I'm just kind of like sprinting around, I'm looking for enemies. I'm not slowing down, looking at like, oh, wow, this texture looks like crap. So I definitely can understand someone just going for the minimum preset. And that is certainly the feedback that I get anytime I benchmark kind of a competitive game like Marvel Rivals, any Call of Duty, Fortnite, stuff like that. Everyone seems to just think, okay, we'll just put it on the lowest settings. Why would you go for anything but the lowest settings? It's not necessarily how I choose to kind of prioritize the games, even the competitive games that I play, but I certainly can appreciate and understand it. And I do think that it is certainly a setting that, you know, is worth exploring. And honestly, here in Call of Duty, where time to kill is so low that, you know, if you just miss even a split second, I can certainly understand more here than ever before prioritizing the FPS. So it is nice to see that on a card that's, again, not necessarily a 4K card, in my opinion, you can come in here and get really competitive 4K settings and a really convincing 4K looking image as well. It's not like you're having to use such aggressive upscaling that doesn't even really look like 4K anymore. So definitely really nice to see that, you know, the settings that we're getting are able to give us such a great experience here. Anyways, guys, that's been it for the RTX 5070 Ti in Call of Duty Black Ops 7. Obviously performed totally great. Really, 1080p, 1440p, it's perfect, like unmatched. There's not really a ton of performance left on the table. Even if you were to have like a 5080, 5090, you're really not missing out on much. When you get to 4K, there are certainly things that you do have to compromise to get a competitive FPS, but considering the fact that we have the transform model, we have so many things at our disposal, there's not really much that you have to compromise on to kind of get the performance that you want. So even 4K is an absolute glowing A, you know, total pass in my opinion. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you next one. Bye-bye.